On December 16, 1920, a chilling earthquake in Haiwan County became China's worst nightmare. The aftershocks continued for 3 years, but it was the survivors who sealed their gruesome fate. From the 1931 China floods to the 2010 Haiti earthquake, these are the world's deadliest natural disasters, and the details are not for the faint of heart. The death toll for the China floods in 1931 is the highest in history, a devastating estimate of 4 million. But the disaster was many years in the making. It all began with a long drought that lasted from 1928 to 1930. Then, the winter leading into 1931 resulted in a buildup of snow and ice in the mountains. This would lead to a spring season straight out of a horror story. When the large amount of snow and ice melted at the beginning of the year, it flowed into the middle of the Yangtze River. However, something else was different about that year. There were heavy rains, with the period of high water lasting far longer than usual, with no relief. Little did anyone know this was just the calm before the storm. By the time June rolled around, unlucky citizens living in the low areas had no choice but to leave their homes. The flooding had officially begun. However, the very next month, the cyclones began. On average, China endured around 2 cyclones every year, but in 1931, they experienced 7 in July alone. The floods wreaked unimaginable havoc on the country, including major cities like Wuhan and Nanjing. They covered approximately 180,000 square kilometers. The horrifying floods lasted from June to August, meeting a horrifying climax on August 25, 1931. With the dike breaching along Lake Gaoyu, the cost of human life was deeply disturbing. According to historians, the number of people affected by the disaster was an estimated 53 million. However, several sources have since reported varying death tolls. One study suggests that 150,000 people drowned during the floods, while the resulting starvation and disease accounted for hundreds of thousands more casualties on top of the number. However, Western sources have placed the number much higher, closer to 4 million. The consequences of the floods spread far and wide. Farmland, housing, and essential crops had been obliterated. This affected the economy in a shocking way. The cost of essentials and food skyrocketed, causing people to starve. And the details of this fallout are harrowing. People were so desperate they resorted to eating whatever they could get their hands on, including tree bark and earth. In some extreme cases, some even cannibalized just to survive. Others made the heartbreaking decision to sell their own children. But somehow, this wasn't the end of it. Perhaps the worst part of the disaster was the spread of disease. With so many refugees, the country experienced overcrowding and the sanitation system suffered. Thousands died from diseases like malaria and measles, leaving this 1931 disaster as a time no one will forget. The Tang Shan Earthquake of 1976. This occurred in the early hours of the morning on July 28, 1976, with a magnitude between 7.8 and 8.2 on the Richter scale, and the Chinese city didn't stand a chance. Due to its location between the Indian and Pacific plates, earthquakes have been notably prevalent in China. It's no wonder they were the first country to create working seismometers. Now, there were certainly warning signs before the earthquake hit. Days before the disaster, people began to notice some bizarre occurrences in the area. Water levels in their wells fluctuated dramatically, but perhaps most startlingly, the animals' behaviors changed. Chickens stopped eating their food while rats began running around in broad daylight, seemingly distressed. But that's not as creepy as the strange lights. Hours before the earthquake rocked Tangshan, people witnessed strange flashing lights and, quote, roaring fireballs, quote. But it wasn't until 3:42 a.m. that the nightmare began. The citizens of Tangshan had gone to sleep the night before, blissfully unaware of the nightmare destined to strike them. However, the timing of the earthquake doomed them, as they would have been far safer out on the streets than inside their homes. The earthquake was swift, but utterly catastrophic. It only took 23 seconds to flatten 90% of the city's buildings. Around 250,000 people lost their lives, while 160,000 suffered injuries. Because it had been a sweltering midsummer night, many of those who survived the earthquake emerged from the wreckage of their homes completely unclothed and bloody. All over the city there were fires. The earthquake caused explosions in the city's factories due to the ignition of toxic gases and explosives. But there were even more horrors in store. Tragically, the Chinese government's reaction to the disaster was deeply disappointing. They simply were not prepared for such a destructive earthquake. Although they sent in 100,000 soldiers, 30,000 medics, and 30,000 construction workers, it wasn't enough. To add insult to injury, they made the chilling decision to refuse any foreign aid. They wanted to prove that the country was strong enough to handle the situation on its own, but it was the people who paid the ultimate price. In the week that followed the earthquake, many injured survivors didn't receive the medical treatment they needed and ended up perishing. On top of this, the troops and workers attempting to rescue folks from the wrecked buildings weren't properly trained. The death toll was staggering, an estimated 242,000. However, some sources believe that it was much higher, closer to 500,000. Additionally, 4,000 children lost both of their parents, while 160,000 families wound up homeless. The Bola Cyclone of 1970. In 1970, a tropical cyclone wreaked havoc in East Pakistan, known as Bangladesh today. It earned the name the Great Cyclone of 1970 for a reason. The 1970 Bola Cyclone is still the deadliest on record, with an estimated 500,000 fatalities. However, the details of the disaster are not for the faint of heart. Originating over the Bay of Bengal on November 8th, the cyclone grew stronger as it moved northward. By November 10th, the winds reached a terrifying 185 kilometers per hour, and the consequences of the storm were devastating. As the cyclone reached land, it annihilated villages, offshore lands, and crops. Tazamudan endured the brunt of the storm, with close to half of its population losing their lives. Sadly, it seemed as though most of the population was completely blindsided by the cyclone. This caused many to criticize East Pakistan's storm warning system, which hadn't done a good enough job of alerting the public. The cyclone changed 3.6 million lives for the worse. According to the survivors, it wiped out around 85% of the homes, especially those along the coast. The fishermen in particular suffered horrifying losses. Not only were 9,000 fishing boats destroyed, but 46,000 fishermen perished. And in the wake of the depleted fishing capacity, the surviving workers struggled. Similarly, the agriculture industry saw the loss of 280,000 cattle, as well as millions of dollars worth of crops. This caused some serious problems. Even 3 months after the cyclone, the people struggled to feed themselves. 75% of people relied on relief workers for sustenance. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. The storm also contaminated the region's water supply, causing the spread of many diseases. This caused a severe delay in necessary medical aid. The cyclone had far-reaching consequences and contributed to the fate of the 1970 Pakistani general election. As the disaster had been handled so poorly, leftist parties boycotted the election, leading to the victory of the Awami League. The pitiful relief efforts enraged those affected in East Pakistan, which fed the resistance movement. These were just some of the seeds leading to the devastating Bangladesh genocide in 1971, which resulted in an estimated death toll between 300,000 to 3 million people. The Haiti Earthquake of 2010. The earthquake that hit Haiti in 2010 caused so much damage that the entire world took notice and reached out with aid. Tragically, there's good reason to believe that the small country still hasn't fully recovered. Throughout history, Haiti has been a hotspot for seismic activity. Major earthquakes hit the country in 1751, 1770, 1842, and 1946. It was practically inevitable for another one to eventually occur. The capital of Haiti basically sits on a fault line. Seismologists had issued warnings for the area, but the nation's Achilles heel was its shocking poverty. They just couldn't afford to strengthen their infrastructure, and they were not prepared for a natural disaster. When the 7.0 magnitude earthquake hit on January 12, 2010, it was almost 5 p.m. But 8 aftershocks followed, as well as 52 over the coming weeks. It caused unbelievable chaos. The capital suffered a terrible blow, with all of its medical centers severely damaged. This included every hospital, as well as 3 Doctors Without Borders facilities. Additionally, the airport and seaport were no longer operational. But that wasn't all. The earthquake destroyed 300,000 buildings and rendered the roadways useless. Even gorgeous architectural landmarks like the cathedral and the National Palace met sad ends. Still, this was nothing compared to the loss of human life. The estimated death toll caused by the earthquake ranges from 40,000 to over 316,000 people. The disaster also displaced close to 1 million people, and the images coming out of Haiti were deeply disturbing and caused other countries to take action and offer humanitarian aid. The first to respond to the tragedy was the Dominican Republic and the Dominican Red Cross. They provided emergency supplies and airlifted victims to hospital. However, they certainly weren't the only ones moved to action. America and Great Britain's air forces swooped in to transport survivors to hospital ships, while other nations sent money and manpower. Additionally, on January 22nd, the Hope for Haiti telethon raised a jaw-dropping $58 million for the cause. However, despite the response from other nations, Haiti still had trouble managing all the help and struggled to deliver aid. An emergency was still in effect half a year later. People were still in dire straits. Displaced victims of the earthquake lived in tents, millions of them. To add insult to injury, disease spread like a wildfire, and in October that year, an epidemic caused 3,300 fatalities. For the next 10 years, Haiti embarked on a long, slow crawl towards a semblance of normalcy. The Kinga Cyclone of 1839. The 1839 Kinga Cyclone hit the southeastern coast of British India on November 25, 1839, but this wasn't the first time the area had faced a destructive storm. Back in 1789, the region experienced losses of over 20,000 people as a result of another cyclone. However, although the storm surges and floods caused serious damage, the port city of Kinga recovered, its harbor becoming a prosperous hub of activity. Sadly, this only foreshadowed its darker future. In 1839, Kinga faced yet another tropical cyclone and emerged in tatters, its harbor completely demolished. The storm comes only second to the notorious Bola Cyclone previously mentioned. More than 30,000 people lost their lives to the cyclone. Flooding bodies of water washed away homes, ruined 200,000 ships, submerged crops, and drowned animals. The extensive damage sealed the city's sad fate. Tragically, there was no silver lining for Kinga. Those who survived decided to leave the cursed city, squashing any hope of rebuilding the obliterated port. Instead, some survivors chose to establish a new community further inland. Quite fittingly, British officials called this area Hope Island. Today, no major port exists in Kinga like the bustling one of the 1800s, but the area is home to the Kinga Wildlife Sanctuary. This area has over 120 species of bird and 24 species of mangrove trees, including the critically endangered white-backed vulture and long-billed vulture. This area has over 335 square kilometers of marsh vegetation and an 18-kilometer-long sand pit. It sits about 8 kilometers away from the port city of Kakinada and experiences over 1,000 millimeters of rainfall every year. Interestingly enough, it was Henry Piddington, a British East India Company official, who used the term cyclone for the first time when describing the cyclones of 1789 and 1839. The word cyclone comes from the Greek word cyclos, which means the coils of a snake. The Haiti Earthquake of 1920. On December 16, 1920, a chilling earthquake became Haiti County's worst nightmare, and based on the high death toll, it's considered one of China's deadliest natural disasters. The estimated magnitude of the earthquake was 8.5, while the cost of human life was an estimated 258,000 to 273,000 people. The destruction was unfathomable. In Haiti County, 73,000 people died, but this was only one slice of the losses. The village of Sujahe fell victim to a landslide, and Guiyuan County saw losses of over 30,000 people. In Longdae and Huning, the earthquake wiped out almost every house. And of course, the damage spread outward to many other cities. Tragically, many people lost their lives to something other than the earthquake, the frigid temperatures. But why did so many people die from the biting cold? For 3 years, the aftershocks continued, causing many of the survivors to refrain from building new homes, and this had fatal consequences. Instead of constructing permanent residences, many folks opted for temporary shelters. Horrifyingly, when an extremely harsh winter descended on the survivors, many of them perished. With temperatures reaching below -11 degrees Celsius and 12 degrees Fahrenheit, the earthquake survivors didn't stand a chance in temporary shelters. Many who were lucky enough to survive the initial 8.5 magnitude earthquake didn't have such luck in the following years. Initially, soldiers and officers were deployed to serve as first responders who distributed tents and emergency supplies to communities in the most hard-hit areas. Some local merchants even helped set up soup kitchens and contributed emergency aid. Unfortunately, this only helped a tiny fraction of the problem, with the loss of life going well into the six figures. Now those were some of the world's deadliest natural disasters. If you find this type of content interesting, drop a like on the video and subscribe so you don't miss out on any more content like this.